July 9, 1943, over the Mediterranean Sea, hundreds of C-47 transport planes hum in the dark, their engines a constant low drone against the still night sky. Inside, U.S. paratroopers sit in the shadows, their faces a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The mission they're about to embark on is unlike anything they've ever done before. Below them, the island of Sicily lies in darkness, its shores lined with Axis defenses. The air smells of salt and gunpowder, a reminder of the war that rages across the globe. These men are about to jump into enemy territory, behind enemy lines, to pave the way for an invasion that will change the course of history. The soldiers don't know what lies ahead. Some have trained for this moment for months. Others are still fresh, unsure of what to expect. But one thing is certain. When they land, they will face immediate, brutal resistance. And yet, as they gear up, there's a steely resolve in their eyes. They will fight. They will win. The U.S. paratroopers landing will be a pivotal moment in the Allied invasion of Sicily, a moment that will stun the Germans and forever alter the landscape of warfare. The year 1943 found World War II at a critical juncture. The Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, had faced a string of defeats that had shaken their dominance across Europe. The tides of war were beginning to turn, but the struggle was far from over. After the successful Allied landings in North Africa earlier in 1942, a new objective emerged: to weaken the Axis hold on southern Europe. Sicily, a key island in the Mediterranean, became the next target for an Allied invasion. Its strategic location provided a direct route to mainland Italy, and its capture would pave the way for the eventual liberation of Europe. In planning for the operation, codenamed Operation Husky, the Allies sought to combine traditional amphibious landings with the innovative use of airborne forces. The United States, having gained valuable experience from earlier campaigns in North Africa, had begun developing elite airborne units capable of making precision landings deep behind enemy lines. These troops would be tasked with securing key objectives in advance of the main invasion forces, disrupting German and Italian defenses, and sowing chaos within enemy ranks. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, seasoned in parachute operations, were chosen to carry out the airborne assault on Sicily. Meanwhile, the Germans were preparing for a difficult defense of Sicily. They had underestimated the possibility of a full-scale invasion of the island, and their forces were scattered and stretched thin. General Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, had fortifications in place, but the bulk of his troops were focused on holding the Italian mainland. The Luftwaffe, having already been battered in previous engagements, lacked the strength to mount a serious counterattack against the airborne assault. Still, the Germans had confidence in their ability to resist the invaders, believing that the terrain and the existing fortifications would provide a solid defense. The stage was set for a collision of forces. U.S. paratroopers, trained in airborne warfare, were about to face the seasoned defenders of the German and Italian forces. And it was the unexpected effectiveness of the American airborne assault that would stun the German officers on the ground. In the lead-up to the invasion, both sides prepared for what would be the largest amphibious operation in the Mediterranean to date. For the Allies, the goal was not just to conquer Sicily, but to send a clear message to both Axis and neutral nations. The Allies were united, relentless, and capable of striking anywhere. The assault would serve as the opening act of a broader campaign to topple Mussolini's regime and open the way for a full-scale invasion of mainland Italy. For the U.S. paratroopers, Operation Husky would be their first large-scale combat jump. The soldiers, primarily from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, had undergone rigorous training, learning to jump into the unknown with only their weapons and essential gear. Unlike their British counterparts, who had a longer history of airborne operations, the Americans relied heavily on new technology and tactics. The C-47 transport planes, modified from civilian aircraft, could carry up to 18 paratroopers, and the men would jump into enemy-held territory to seize critical positions, airfields, bridges, and towns, before the main landing force arrived. The Germans, for their part, had anticipated the possibility of an Allied invasion in Italy, but believed that a direct assault on Sicily was unlikely. While they had fortified the island, their defenses were not as robust as those on the mainland. The German officers on Sicily were caught off guard by the boldness and precision of the American airborne attack, which struck swiftly and with overwhelming force. But the Allies were not without their own challenges. The operation was complicated by the vast distance between the paratroopers' drop zones and the beaches where the amphibious landings would occur. The night of the jump was shrouded in uncertainty, with many of the paratroopers unsure of the exact locations of their drop zones. Some of the soldiers would be dropped miles from their intended targets, forcing them to fight their way to their objectives under the cover of darkness. As dawn approached on July 10, 1943, the U.S. paratroopers would land in Sicily and face the full brunt of Axis resistance, but they would not be deterred. The German officers stationed on the island had prepared for a traditional invasion, but what they encountered instead was a force that fought with unmatched tenacity and resourcefulness. The effectiveness of the U.S. paratroopers would prove to be one of the key turning points of the invasion. As dawn broke over Sicily on July 10, 1943, the U.S. paratroopers began their descent. The initial objective was to seize key airfields, disrupt Axis communications, and create confusion among the German defenders before the main amphibious landings took place. The airborne assault would create a diversion, drawing German forces away from the beaches, where the bulk of the Allied invasion force would land. However, the execution of the jump itself was fraught with difficulties. The paratroopers had been briefed on their drop zones, but the reality was far from what they had expected. The drop was scattered, with many of the C-47s flying off course due to poor weather conditions, heavy anti-aircraft fire from the Germans, and navigational errors. Some paratroopers found themselves miles from their intended landing zones, others landed in swamps, and some found themselves caught in dense forests. The chaos of the drop did not deter the soldiers, however. It only added to the resilience and adaptability that became the hallmark of the American airborne forces. In the face of these challenges, the U.S. paratroopers quickly adapted. They rallied around their leaders and improvised with the resources they had. Many of the paratroopers carried only the basics: rifles, machine guns, grenades, and ammunition, along with a small pack of supplies. Yet, with these meager tools, they were able to capture crucial positions. The 82nd Airborne Division, for example, secured the Primo Mazzarino airfield, while the 101st Airborne took control of the San Cono airfield. These airfields would later be vital in supporting the ground forces in the coming days. The German defenders, led by commanders such as General Kesselring, were caught by surprise. They had expected a conventional landing, with the Allies assaulting from the sea in the tradition of previous invasions. Instead, they faced an enemy that was already on the ground, behind their lines, carrying out coordinated attacks and sabotaging their communications. The Germans had underestimated the potential of airborne forces and had not prepared for such a bold, direct strike into their rear guard. The first hours after the jump were marked by confusion and panic within the German ranks. Many of the German soldiers were not fully prepared for the effectiveness of the airborne assault, which struck swiftly and aggressively. They struggled to respond, as they had not anticipated a force that would be so scattered yet so formidable. In the initial chaos, U.S. paratroopers managed to destroy critical German equipment, including artillery pieces, tanks, and trucks, severely disrupting their ability to mount an effective defense. The Americans had achieved a measure of success, but the battle was far from over. As they fought to secure the airfields, they had to contend with the German counterattacks, which came swiftly and with overwhelming force. The terrain, with its rocky hills, dense forests, and winding roads, provided both challenges and advantages for the paratroopers. They used their mobility to their advantage, setting ambushes and launching hit-and-run attacks on German positions. But it was not without heavy casualties. The fight for control of Sicily had just begun, and it would take everything the U.S. paratroopers had to hold their ground. As the hours turned into days, the airborne assault began to take shape. The Germans, though initially stunned by the ferocity of the American paratroopers, quickly regrouped. They launched a counteroffensive to push the Allies out of key positions. However, the paratroopers' ability to maintain control, despite being outnumbered, would come to define the success of the operation. Meanwhile, the main amphibious invasion was underway on the southern coast of Sicily. The beach landings would not go as smoothly as anticipated. The initial resistance was fierce and the Allies faced heavy casualties. But the paratroopers had already created a foothold in key areas, providing crucial support for the larger landing force. Their actions forced the Germans to divert their attention away from the beaches, buying valuable time for the Allies to establish a strong presence on the island. As the days wore on, the U.S. paratroopers continued to harass the German defenses, preventing them from regrouping effectively. Despite the challenges, the airborne forces held their ground and contributed significantly to the success of the invasion. The Germans, who had initially underestimated the effectiveness of the U.S. airborne forces, were now fully aware of the threat posed by these elite troops. It would be a lesson they would not soon forget. The men who jumped into Sicily on that fateful night were not the hardened veterans of previous campaigns. Most were fresh recruits, thrust into their first combat jump. The faces of the soldiers reflected a range of emotions: fear, excitement, and uncertainty. But there was something else in their eyes, a resolve, born of months of grueling training, that would carry them through the storm that awaited them. For many of these paratroopers, the jump was a test of courage and endurance. They had trained extensively, learning how to parachute out of a plane into a hostile environment, how to navigate the rugged terrain of Sicily, and how to carry out their mission under extreme stress. Yet, as they prepared to board the C-47 transport planes that night, there was no way to fully prepare for the chaos they were about to face. The men knew the risks. There were no guarantees in war. They would either succeed in their mission or die trying. The drop itself was chaotic. Many soldiers found themselves scattered across the island, miles from their designated landing zones. They were immediately thrust into a fight for survival. Despite being separated from their units and disoriented by the misdrops, they continued to fight, sometimes alone, sometimes in small, isolated groups, against the German forces. It was a true test of individual resolve. They could hear the crackle of enemy fire and feel the ground shake with the rumble of artillery. But they moved forward, because they knew there was no turning back. As one paratrooper later recalled, "You didn't have time to be scared. You just did what you had to do." The men banded together in the chaos, often without a clear leader, relying on each other to push forward. Every man was responsible for his own survival and for helping his comrades stay alive. The human element of the paratrooper assault, their bravery, their determination, and their camaraderie, was a crucial factor in the success of the operation. These men would go on to become the unsung heroes of Sicily, their names lost in the history of the war, but their actions forever etched in the narrative of airborne warfare, the tactical ingenuity of the U.S. paratroopers. During the Sicily invasion was evident from the outset. The airborne assault was designed to be a diversion, a way to destabilize the German defenses before the main amphibious landing took place. Yet, the paratroopers went far beyond mere disruption. They created chaos within the German lines and disrupted the flow of communications, forcing the enemy to respond in unexpected ways. The primary objective for the paratroopers was to capture airfields, which would allow the Allies to bring in reinforcements and supplies. These airfields were critical to the success of the larger amphibious operation. But the paratroopers did not simply land and wait for orders. they immediately took action. Once on the ground, they began clearing the airfields of German forces, setting up defensive positions, and launching raids on German supply lines. The Germans, expecting a traditional landing, were caught off guard. The paratroopers did not wait to be attacked. They took the fight to the enemy. One of the most effective tactics used by the U.S. paratroopers was their ability to strike from unexpected angles. The Germans had heavily fortified certain positions, but the paratroopers, knowing that they were outnumbered, opted for surprise. They used the island's terrain, its rocky hills, dense forests, and narrow roads, to their advantage, using guerrilla tactics to harass and confuse the enemy. They set up ambushes, attacked German patrols, and seized key strongholds, all the while preventing the Germans from regrouping or reinforcing their positions. This decentralized approach to combat was one of the keys to the airborne operation's success. The paratroopers didn't rely on traditional military formations or chain-of-command instructions. Instead, they acted as independent units, each with the freedom to pursue tactical advantages as they saw fit. Their mission was clear: disrupt, disorient, and defeat the German forces in their path. The technological advantage that the U.S. paratroopers had over their German counterparts was significant, and it played a crucial role in the success of the operation. While the Germans had a well-established air defense system, the Allies had adapted to new technologies that allowed them to execute precision operations. One of the most important technological advancements used in Operation Husky was the C-47 transport aircraft, which carried the paratroopers into Sicily. The C-47, a modified version of the civilian DC-3, was a reliable and durable plane that could carry a full load of paratroopers and their equipment. The plane had a range of 2,500 miles, which allowed it to fly from the Allied bases in North Africa to Sicily and back without refueling. The C-47s were fitted with special doors that opened on command, allowing the paratroopers to jump in quick succession. In addition to the C-47s, the use of gliders was another important technological innovation. These silent, non-motorized aircraft were towed behind transport planes and released over the drop zones. While not as widely used as the parachute assault, the gliders carried heavier equipment, such as artillery pieces and jeeps, that the paratroopers would need once on the ground. The use of gliders allowed for a more complete airborne assault, as it ensured that the paratroopers had the necessary tools to fight and establish a foothold immediately after landing. While the Germans had some technological advantages, such as the Flak 88 anti-aircraft guns, the Allies' combined use of airborne tactics and modern transport technology caught them by surprise. The ability to deliver troops and supplies behind enemy lines with such precision and speed was a game-changer. It was a glimpse into the future of warfare, one that relied not just on ground forces but on the speed and flexibility of airborne units that could strike at the heart of an enemy before they had time to react. The leadership displayed by both the American commanders and the German officers during the Sicily invasion was integral to the outcome of the operation. On the Allied side, the U.S. military's airborne leadership showed remarkable adaptability, even as their forces were scattered across the island. The men on the ground, led by officers such as Major General Matthew Ridgway of the 82nd Airborne Division, were thrown into a chaotic situation but rose to the challenge. Ridgway's leadership style was centered around decisive action. After the paratroopers were scattered due to misdrops, Ridgway took immediate action, coordinating quick regrouping efforts to consolidate forces. His instructions were clear: do what you must to achieve your mission. Don't wait for orders if the situation demands action. This decentralized leadership style proved essential in maintaining control and momentum during the airborne assault. Ridgway understood the importance of initiative, and this approach empowered his soldiers to take the fight to the enemy, regardless of the confusion they faced. Meanwhile, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, who commanded the U.S. 7th Army during the main amphibious landing, kept a close eye on the airborne operations. His aggressive approach to leadership complemented that of Ridgway's forces. Patton was known for his boldness and desire to press forward, no matter the obstacle. He recognized the critical role of the airborne units and understood that their success would directly impact the outcome of the larger operation. His leadership on the ground, combined with the paratroopers' effective airborne assault, helped maintain the initiative and prevent any significant German counterattacks. On the German side, leadership was less unified. General Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, had the daunting task of defending Sicily against the overwhelming Allied invasion. However, the German response was hampered by a lack of clear coordination. Kesselring's forces were spread thin across the island, and the sudden shock of the airborne assault caught them off guard. While Kesselring attempted to rally his troops, many German commanders were unprepared for the speed and intensity of the American airborne assault. The inability of the German leadership to adapt quickly to the new tactics employed by the Allies was a significant weakness. As U.S. paratroopers secured key positions, German forces were often slow to react. There was no immediate unified command response, and German officers struggled to regain control of areas that had been overrun by the paratroopers. This confusion within the German ranks further highlighted the leadership gap that existed during the operation. The German response to the U.S. airborne assault in Sicily was one of initial shock and disbelief. When the first waves of paratroopers landed, the Germans were taken by surprise. The Germans had been preparing for a traditional invasion, expecting the Allies to land on the beaches. The presence of U.S. paratroopers deep behind enemy lines, already engaging German forces, was something they had not anticipated. German officers in Sicily were caught in a difficult position. They had built a defense structure on the island based on their assumptions about how the invasion would unfold, but the airborne assault rendered much of their preparation useless. The German command assumed that any airborne forces would be small-scale, intended merely as a distraction before the real invasion arrived. What they faced instead were heavily armed and determined paratroopers who struck fast and with precision. The Germans underestimated the strength of the airborne forces, particularly their ability to fight without immediate reinforcements. When U.S. paratroopers began launching raids, destroying German equipment, and taking critical positions, the German command scrambled to respond. They had not prepared for such an unconventional assault and found themselves unable to quickly adapt their tactics to the new reality on the ground. Despite their shock, the German forces were not without resourcefulness. They launched counterattacks to regain control of the key objectives, particularly the airfields that the U.S. paratroopers had captured. However, these efforts were often hampered by the scattered nature of their defenses and the limited coordination between their units. German forces, initially disoriented by the airborne assault, slowly began to regroup. But by then, the Allies had established a significant foothold in Sicily. The Germans were forced to shift their focus away from the beaches, where the amphibious landing had occurred, and dedicate more resources to countering the airborne threat. This was a testament to the unexpected effectiveness of the U.S. paratroopers, their ability to disrupt the enemy's plans, and force the Germans to fight on multiple fronts. The psychological impact of the airborne assault on both the German and Allied forces cannot be overstated. For the U.S. paratroopers, the moral challenge was immense. They were dropped into enemy territory under the cover of darkness, without any guarantee of success or safety. The men knew that their mission was critical, and they understood that failure could lead to devastating consequences. Yet, despite the uncertainty and fear, they pressed on with unwavering determination. The paratroopers' courage was contagious. As they fought to secure their objectives, their resolve inspired those around them. The German defenders, on the other hand, were less certain. For many of the German soldiers, this was the first time they had encountered airborne forces on such a scale. The sight of U.S. paratroopers behind enemy lines, fighting with such ferocity and adaptability, was demoralizing. They were accustomed to defending fixed positions, not facing an enemy that could strike from unexpected angles. The psychological impact on the Germans was compounded by the realization that the Allies were not just capable of launching a full-scale invasion. They were now able to employ a new form of warfare that rendered traditional defenses obsolete. The moral weight of this realization was heavy for the German officers, who had prided themselves on their ability to hold strong positions and repulse enemy attacks. The airborne assault shattered this confidence, leaving them vulnerable to further Allied advances. For the Allies, the success of the airborne assault boosted morale in ways that would resonate throughout the war. It demonstrated the potential of airborne forces and solidified their place in modern warfare. The U.S. paratroopers' courage and effectiveness were not just tactical victories, they were psychological victories, showing the world that the Allies could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. As the first glimmers of dawn broke over the island of Sicily, the scale of the airborne assault became evident. The U.S. paratroopers had completed their initial jump, but the real battle had only just begun. Despite facing a myriad of challenges, from missed drops to scattered landings, the airborne forces pressed forward, securing key airfields and disrupting German communications. The Germans, caught by surprise, scrambled to respond to this unconventional assault that threatened to undermine their entire defense strategy. The first major clash occurred at Primo Mazzarino Airfield, located on the eastern edge of Sicily. This airfield, which was of critical importance to the Germans for their operations on the island, had been captured by the 82nd Airborne Division. The men who held this position had no time to celebrate their success. Within hours, German counterattacks began. The first wave of German reinforcements, brought in from nearby positions, attempted to recapture the airfield. But the paratroopers, having fortified their position with limited resources, held their ground against a force much larger than their own. The intensity of the fighting at Primo Mazzarino was unlike anything the U.S. paratroopers had faced before. The Germans, in an effort to regain control of the airfield, launched a series of relentless attacks using tanks, infantry, and artillery. But the American soldiers, relying on their training and adaptability, repelled each attack. Their ability to hold a fortified position, despite being outnumbered and surrounded, proved the effectiveness of the airborne assault. At the same time, on the San Cono airfield, the 101st Airborne Division was engaged in similar fighting. Like the 82nd, the 101st had landed behind enemy lines, and their first task was to capture the airfield before the Germans could launch a counteroffensive. They, too, faced heavy resistance, as German forces quickly realized the importance of these airfields. The battle for control of San Cono was fierce, but the American paratroopers' superior mobility and quick thinking allowed them to maintain control, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the island's interior. Both airfields were pivotal in the success of the invasion. By seizing them early, the airborne forces had ensured that Allied ground troops, who were landing on the southern beaches, would have immediate access to critical air support. This coordination between the airborne and amphibious forces became a defining feature of the operation. As the airborne troops held their ground, they created a secure perimeter that allowed the ground forces to land without significant resistance. Yet, as the paratroopers fought to secure the airfields, the battle for Sicily was far from won. The Germans, despite the initial setbacks, began regrouping and launching counterattacks with greater intensity. The main Axis strategy was to retake the airfields and sever the Allies' supply lines, which would disrupt the entire invasion. The U.S. paratroopers found themselves on the defensive, as German forces began to mount a concerted effort to dislodge them from their positions. At the same time, the larger amphibious assault was underway on the southern coast of Sicily. The U.S. forces, under the command of General Patton, were landing on the beaches at Gela and Scogliti. These landings were not as smooth as the Allies had hoped. The Germans, though reeling from the airborne assault, launched a counteroffensive to retake lost positions using tanks and infantry. But the paratroopers, having established footholds behind enemy lines, provided critical support to the beach landings, buying time for reinforcements to reach the shores. The Germans' ability to regroup and launch counterattacks revealed a crucial turning point in the battle. Although they had initially been caught off guard, the German forces began to fight back with ferocity. The true measure of the paratroopers' effectiveness lay not in their initial successes, but in their ability to hold the ground they had taken, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The Germans, forced to divide their forces and fight on multiple fronts, found themselves stretched thin and unable to mount an effective counteroffensive. In the skies above, the Luftwaffe attempted to intervene, but their effectiveness had been severely diminished. The German Air Force had already suffered heavy losses in previous battles, and by the time of the Sicilian campaign, it lacked the resources to challenge the Allied air dominance. This technological imbalance was a crucial factor in the Germans' inability to regain the initiative. Without air superiority, the Germans were at a distinct disadvantage, especially as the Allies controlled the skies above the battlefield. Despite the German counterattacks, the Americans continued to push forward. The key to the Allied success was not only the airborne forces' effectiveness, but also their ability to coordinate with the ground troops, ensuring that the Germans were forced to fight a two-front war. As the days passed, it became clear that the Allies were slowly but steadily gaining the upper hand on the island. The Germans, unable to dislodge the paratroopers from their positions, were forced into a defensive posture, unable to prevent the Allies from solidifying their hold on Sicily. As the battle raged on, the intense fighting around the airfields marked the high point of the airborne operation's success. The paratroopers, having disrupted the German defenses and created chaos within their ranks, continued to hold their ground, even as German counterattacks intensified. The real turning point came as the Germans, now realizing the effectiveness of the U.S. airborne assault, were forced to shift from an offensive mindset to a defensive one, marking a significant change in the course of the battle. By July 11th, the situation on the island was becoming clearer. The Germans, though initially caught by surprise, had regrouped and launched a series of counterattacks aimed at recapturing the key airfields and halting the Allied advance. But the German effort was hampered by disorganization and the logistical challenges of moving reinforcements across the island. Despite their superior numbers, the Germans could not coordinate their response in a way that allowed them to dislodge the paratroopers from the positions they had captured. The airfields remained in Allied hands, and the U.S. forces continued to expand their control over the island. One of the most significant moments came when the 82nd Airborne Division, after successfully holding its ground at Primo Mazzarino Airfield, launched a daring counterattack against German positions. This bold move was a demonstration of the airborne troops' ability to maintain the initiative, even when faced with overwhelming enemy forces. The Germans, unable to respond quickly enough, found themselves on the defensive once again. The capture of Catania, a key port city on the eastern coast of Sicily, was another critical moment. This victory not only solidified the Allied hold on the island's infrastructure, but also allowed the Allies to establish a vital supply line for the ongoing invasion. The importance of Catania was not lost on the Germans, who realized that losing the port would make it nearly impossible to reinforce their troops on the island. The battle for Catania was fierce, with the U.S. paratroopers playing a pivotal role in securing the city's outskirts. Their ability to coordinate with ground forces ensured that the Germans were unable to bring in reinforcements in time to turn the tide. Despite these successes, the Germans were not yet defeated. On July 12th, they launched a last-ditch effort to push the Allies back, focusing their attention on the beachheads in the south and attempting to push back the advancing U.S. forces. However, the Germans were now fighting a losing battle. The combined efforts of the paratroopers and the ground forces had stretched their defenses thin. The Allies were steadily gaining momentum, and with every passing day, the Germans were losing their grip on the island. By mid-July, the situation was becoming untenable for the Axis forces. The Germans had suffered significant losses, both in terms of men and equipment, and their ability to maintain an effective defense on Sicily had been shattered. The capture of the island's key positions, particularly the airfields, and the ability of the U.S. forces to hold those positions despite German counterattacks, had changed the dynamics of the battle. The Germans, unable to recover, began to withdraw in some sectors, while others simply crumbled under the weight of the relentless Allied assault. The turning point came not just from the strength of the paratroopers' initial landings, but from their persistence in holding critical ground. The German military, accustomed to defending fixed positions, was unprepared for the agility and resilience of the airborne forces. The success of the paratroopers in Sicily marked a shift in the nature of warfare, proving that the modern battlefield was no longer confined to static defense lines, but could be shaped by fast-moving, flexible forces that could strike from unexpected angles. By July 17th, the Germans began to pull back, realizing that the Allies were well on their way to victory. The battle for Sicily was nearing its end. The U.S. paratroopers, despite their challenges and initial setbacks, had proven that their bold tactics could achieve success even in the most difficult circumstances. The operation had been a stunning success, not just in terms of tactical objectives, but in the psychological impact it had on both the German forces and the broader war effort. The paratroopers' ability to disrupt the German defense and hold critical positions behind enemy lines had proven invaluable in the success of the larger amphibious assault. By the time the Allies had secured Sicily, the groundwork had already been laid for the next phase of the war in Italy. The U.S. airborne forces had shown their worth in the battle, forever altering the course of the conflict. With the capture of Sicily, the Allies had achieved a major victory in the Mediterranean theater, and the success of the airborne operation played a pivotal role in this achievement. By the time the final German forces withdrew from the island, the operational goals of Operation Husky had been realized. Sicily was secured, but the consequences of this victory extended far beyond the island itself. It was the beginning of a new phase in the war that would directly affect both the Allies and the Axis powers. The immediate aftermath of the Battle for Sicily saw the Germans reeling from the unexpected effectiveness of the U.S. paratroopers. The paratroopers' success had forced the German High Command to revise its strategies and rethink its assumptions about the capabilities of airborne forces. The Germans had underestimated the American airborne units, assuming that they would be unable to sustain themselves behind enemy lines. The fact that the U.S. paratroopers not only survived, but succeeded in holding critical positions, such as airfields, for days on end had a profound impact on German morale. On the Allied side, the victory in Sicily was a much-needed boost to morale. The success of the airborne assault showed that the Allies could execute complex, high-risk operations with precision. The coordination between the airborne forces and the amphibious landing forces, which had been uncertain before the operation, proved to be effective and set a precedent for future combined operations. The ability to land airborne forces behind enemy lines and link up with the main invasion force on the beaches was a breakthrough in military strategy. It was a tactic that would be used again in later campaigns, including the Normandy landings in 1944. However, the victory came at a significant cost. The U.S. paratroopers suffered heavy casualties during the operation. Of the 2,400 men from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions who participated in the airborne assault, nearly 1,000 were either killed, wounded, or captured. The difficult terrain, scattered landings, and constant German counterattacks made the operation a brutal test of endurance. Yet, despite these losses, the U.S. airborne forces had accomplished their mission, proving their ability to operate independently and effectively in a hostile environment. The Germans, while not completely defeated, had been forced into a defensive posture. They were no longer able to dictate the flow of the battle as they had hoped. The loss of key positions like the airfields and the disruption of their lines of communication and supply would have long-lasting effects on the Axis campaign in the Mediterranean. The Germans had no choice but to divert resources away from the island, weakening their overall position in Europe. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, they retreated to the mainland of Italy, where they would eventually attempt to fortify their defenses in preparation for the Allied invasion of Italy. For the Allies, the capture of Sicily had broader strategic consequences. The island provided a launching point for the subsequent Italian campaign. The Allies had gained control of a critical piece of real estate in the Mediterranean, from which they could launch further operations into Europe. While the fighting in Italy would prove to be a protracted and difficult campaign, Sicily marked a turning point. It was the first time that the Allies had successfully invaded Axis-controlled territory in Europe, and it set the stage for the eventual liberation of Western Europe. One of the most immediate and symbolic effects of the victory in Sicily was the downfall of Benito Mussolini. The success of the Allied invasion, combined with the ongoing pressure from other fronts, forced the Italian fascist leader to resign on July 25, 1943. Mussolini's removal from power was a blow to the Axis, and it signaled the beginning of Italy's shift from its alliance with Germany to an eventual surrender to the Allies later that year. This shift weakened the Axis position in Europe and set the stage for the eventual Italian surrender in 1943, contributing to the Axis's downfall. In the months following the operation, the Allies would exploit their success in Sicily by continuing their push up the Italian peninsula. While the terrain and the German defenses in Italy proved to be formidable, the momentum from the Sicilian campaign provided the Allies with the upper hand in the opening stages of the Italian campaign. The victory in Sicily also had profound psychological and strategic effects on both the Axis and Allied powers. For the Allies, the capture of Sicily demonstrated the success of combined arms tactics, particularly the use of airborne forces. It marked a turning point in how military leaders viewed the role of airborne units in modern warfare. What had started as a risky experiment with paratroopers had now evolved into a proven strategy. The success of the airborne assault during Operation Husky set the stage for future large-scale airborne operations, most notably the Normandy invasion, D-Day, in 1944, where airborne units would play a crucial role in securing the beaches and disrupting German defenses. On the other hand, for the Germans, the loss of Sicily was a humiliating defeat that reshaped their strategy in the Mediterranean and across Europe. The effectiveness of the U.S. paratroopers left a lasting impression on German commanders. They had been forced to confront the reality that the Allies were capable of fighting and winning on multiple fronts, using tactics and technologies that the Germans were either unprepared for or incapable of countering. The airborne assault disrupted the Germans' conventional thinking about warfare, making it clear that the Allies were capable of launching surprise attacks and rapidly exploiting weaknesses in the German defense. In the wake of the invasion, German forces began to rethink their strategy on the European mainland. They realized that they could no longer rely solely on traditional defense lines and entrenched positions. The Allies had proven they could fight a flexible and dynamic war, and the Germans were forced to adjust their approach. The lessons learned from the airborne assault in Sicily would inform German tactics and counterattacks for the rest of the war, though they would never be able to fully regain the advantage. One significant aspect of the aftermath was the impact on morale within the Axis and the Allies. The Allied forces, particularly the U.S. paratroopers, were buoyed by their success. The paratroopers had shown that they could operate independently, endure hardship, and complete their objectives despite being isolated and outnumbered. This success provided a psychological boost to the Allied cause and was a turning point for the troops, who were now fully confident in their ability to fight and win in future campaigns. The victory in Sicily also sent a powerful message to other countries occupied by the Axis powers, providing hope and a sense of urgency to the resistance movements across Europe. On the other side, the Germans were demoralized by the loss of Sicily. It was a setback for them at a time when they were already facing difficulties on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. The German military had to divert significant resources to try to defend the island, and this effort had drained both men and materials. The loss of Sicily also isolated the Axis forces in North Africa, as the Allies now had a clear path to advance through Italy. The Germans had stretched their resources thin, and the loss of Sicily was a clear sign that the Axis was losing its grip on European dominance. The aftermath also saw a shift in the Italian political landscape. Mussolini's removal from power was a significant blow to the Axis. His ousting by the Italian king and the subsequent signing of an armistice with the Allies in September 1943 marked Italy's exit from the war as an Axis power. The fall of Mussolini sent shockwaves throughout Europe and created a significant rift between Italy and its former allies, Germany. The German occupation of northern Italy followed, but the loss of Sicily had severely weakened their ability to hold the peninsula. The Italians would continue to resist German occupation, and in the months that followed, Italy became a battleground between the retreating Axis forces and the advancing Allies. For the U.S., the operation was a validation of their growing power on the world stage. The successful coordination of airborne and amphibious forces in Sicily set the standard for future joint operations in World War II. The lessons learned from Operation Husky, particularly regarding airborne tactics, would directly influence the planning of subsequent operations, such as Operation Overlord, D-Day, which would prove to be a decisive turning point in the war. The long-term strategic consequences were far-reaching. The capture of Sicily disrupted the Axis Mediterranean strategy and paved the way for the subsequent invasion of Italy. The fall of Sicily had wider implications for the war in Europe, as it forced the Germans to shift their focus and resources to defend the Italian mainland, weakening their ability to fortify other critical fronts. The Allies now had a foothold in Europe, and the campaign would continue to gain momentum as they moved northward through Italy, ultimately leading to the collapse of Mussolini's regime and contributing to the downfall of the Axis powers. The success of U.S. paratroopers in Sicily was a defining moment in the evolution of modern warfare. The daring airborne assault, though chaotic and riddled with challenges, demonstrated the effectiveness of new military strategies that combined mobility, surprise, and precision. For the first time in history, paratroopers had not only landed deep behind enemy lines, but had held their ground against determined German forces. The operation became a cornerstone for airborne tactics, inspiring future generations of soldiers and shaping military doctrine for decades to come. But the victory in Sicily was not just a military achievement. It was a symbol of resilience, adaptability, and the human spirit. The U.S. paratroopers, though faced with disorienting drops, harsh terrain, and fierce enemy resistance, carried out their mission with an unwavering commitment to their comrades and their cause. Their courage and tenacity in the face of adversity served as a testament to the strength of the men who fought in the skies and on the ground that summer. For the Germans, the airborne assault in Sicily marked a painful realization that the Allies were not just capable of conventional warfare, but were adept at using the unexpected as a weapon. The Germans, caught off guard by the airborne assault, were forced to rethink their approach to defense and warfare. The effectiveness of the U.S. paratroopers shattered their confidence in their own defensive strategies and would resonate throughout the war. Sicily was not just a victory on the battlefield. It was a pivotal moment in the grand arc of World War II. It was a moment when the Allies, through the combined efforts of soldiers, airmen, and sailors, had made an indelible mark on history. The capture of Sicily set the stage for the eventual downfall of the Axis powers, opening a path into Italy and eventually to the heart of Nazi Germany itself. In the end, the success of the airborne assault on Sicily demonstrated that warfare, like history, is shaped by the decisions, actions, and bravery of individuals. The U.S. paratroopers who fought in those early days of Operation Husky became an enduring symbol of the courage and innovation that would define the Allied victories in the years to come. And as the world moved into the later stages of the war, the legacy of Sicily, the lessons learned, the lives lost, and the strategies forged remained a beacon of determination and a reminder that in the darkest moments of conflict, victory often comes from those willing to jump into the unknown.